So thanks very much for having me. It's delighted to be here. I'm just going to talk a bit today about earthworms and soil health, really. And I thought I'd start because all earthworm ecologists love to start with quotes from Darwin. With a quote from Darwin, here he is, towards the end of his life in about 1881. He wrote a book called The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. I don't know whether any of you have read it or not. It's got many merits, this book. It's a lot shorter than The Origin of the Species, and it's a lot more fun to read as well. And it's full of lots of wonderful quotes like this one here. It may be doubted whether there are many other animals which have played so important a part in the history of the world as have these lowly organized creatures. And some of what we're going to talk about today is how earthworms, one of the roles that earthworms play in the world is looking after our soils, but not necessarily always. So if you talk to people about earthworms, like I often do, generally there's a wide acceptance of the good stuff that earthworms do in soils. And I'm sure if I asked you guys, you'd have come up with similar sorts of responses to the people that I talked to about 6 months ago, who generated this word cloud. So earthworms are useful in soils because they aerate the soil, they decompose organic matter that releases nutrients, which helps plants grow, for example. And we can see that in many ways. Just because this is a nice, fun image, I thought I'd show you this. It's always riding your luck, particularly when you failed to share your screen once already. But here's a movie which will hopefully gradually reveal some earthworms and their burrows, which they formed whilst living in a drain pipe filled of soil. So this is an X-ray tomography scan. It's kind of equivalent to the sort of scanners people use in hospitals. It's got false color imaging, and we can see the wonderful burrow network that earthworms create. And those burrows, of course, allow soils to drain. If it rains, they help oxygen get into the soil for things to grow, and they actually help soils store water as well. And then, of course, because earthworms often consume soil, they also excrete soil. And so we see earthworm casts like these on the soil surface. But they're also present deep in the soil because not all earthworms cast on the surface. And these casts, again, have a number of beneficial properties in soils. For example, they actually help reduce soil erosion. They're also hotspots of available nutrients and bacterial activity. We also see, for example, that earthworms boost plant growth. So here are some experiments we did in the lab. You'll see later on that I'm a better photographer than I am an artist, but even my photography is not great. But hopefully you can see this plant is somewhat larger than this one on the right. And the plant in the middle of our screen is one which grew in the presence of earthworms. And so generally, for a variety of reasons related to nutrition, but also microbial populations, earthworms boost plant growth. So again, that's a good thing that earthworms do. And finally, although this is not necessarily good news for the earthworms, they also make good eating if you're an animal. And earthworms form the basis of many food webs as well, and are important to have for thriving biodiverse ecosystems. So it's fairly well acknowledged that earthworms are a good thing in general. And certainly here in the UK, although things are slightly up in the air, you might have heard we've had some political turmoil in the last few months, but there's a move within government to change the way that farmers are funded. And part of that funding scheme, it seems, will involve earthworms. So as yet, I'm not going to sort of go into any detail about these possible funding schemes, but it does seem likely that monitoring earthworms on farms and rewarding farmers if earthworm populations increase will be a component of how payment systems to farmers in the UK at least are made. So that brings me to another quote from Darwin from his wonderful book. And that is that even on the same field, worms are much more frequent in some places than in others, without any visible difference in the nature of the soil. And it's an interesting observation that Darwin made, and it still holds true today. And so one thing that I wonder about as we talk about the benefits of earthworms and incorporating them into some sort of farmer's payment system, is if we don't know what controls where earthworms are found on soils, how can we incorporate earthworms into some sort of funding system? So really, I think about these sorts of questions. What is a healthy soil? If we're going to use earthworms to indicate whether a soil is healthy or not, what do we think a healthy soil is? Because if we're saying a healthy soil is one which contains earthworms, and then we look at earthworms to find out whether a soil is healthy, that's a somewhat circular argument. And I go on to wonder about whether healthy soils have to contain earthworms or not. So is it possible that a soil could be perfectly healthy without containing earthworms? And those are some of the questions that I'm going to address in the rest of this talk. And I'm going to start off with this example, which is not any of my research, but then I'm going to go on to some of the research that I've done over the years. And here, if we were in person, or I was talking to a group of my students, what I'd be asking here is which of these forests, the one on the left-hand column or the one on the right-hand column, looks the healthiest to you guys? And which do we think contains some healthy soil? And it's an interesting question because these images, the left-hand column where you can see lots of greenery and lots of small shrubs, and the right-hand image where you can see fairly patchy surface cover of vegetation. These images are actually taken in pretty much the same place in America. One is looking to the left and one is looking to the right. And you may or may not feel that one of these soils and these ecosystems is healthier than the other. But the one on the right-hand side, which contains less or fewer species and far less leaf litter, is actually the one which is containing abundant earthworms. And the columns on the left are completely earthworm-free. And so this is an interesting case where earthworms are actually acting as invasive species in America and Canada. So in the last glaciation, a lot of northern America and Canada was covered in ice sheets, and those essentially scraped all the soil off the rocks. So at the end of the ice age, soil formation had to start again. And because you'd lost the soil, you'd also lost the organisms which lived in the soil. So it was only when Europeans rediscovered America, or discovered America, invaded America, you can use the terminology you want, with soil as ballast in their ships, that European earthworms became introduced into America. And therefore, those earthworms are acting as invasive species. So it's not just people like the Pilgrim farmers who are responsible for this. There's some wonderful dispensing machines dotted around America, around fishing lakes. So these are shots from the Great Lakes area of North America, where you can actually get earthworms out of a machine. This is again, an earthworm ecologist dream. If you want to go and sample earthworms, you just put a few dollars into this machine and out pop your earthworms. But what you find is if you go to some of these sites and look at the distribution of earthworms, they are concentrated around fishing stages in the Great Lakes. And then around the roads which lead to those fishing stages. And then gradually earthworms have spread into the forests. And what happens when you get into the forests is you move from this left-hand picture, which is headed lightly infested. We don't often think about earthworm infestations, but this is a sort of native ecosystem with relatively few earthworms in it, with a thick organic matter layer present in the soil. And as you become infested with earthworms, so the earthworms have invaded here, they've occupied a niche, an ecological niche, which was previously unoccupied, they break down a lot of that organic matter and thin that organic matter layer in the soil. And as you can see on the photographs that we saw before, that has a significant impact on the ecosystems. So I wouldn't really want to say whether one of these soils or the other is healthier or not, but certainly the introduction of earthworms here has changed the ecosystem entirely and had a significant effect. And if we want to preserve pristine ecosystems, this suggests that at least in some areas of the world, increasing earthworm numbers is not necessarily a good thing. So that's one example, albeit maybe slightly specialized or unusual, where I would argue that earthworms aren't necessarily a good thing in terms of soil health. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another example now. We're moving into the areas of my own research, when I've looked at distributions of earthworms in the UK. And so here we've got a picture of two earthworms. They're a type of earthworm called Lumbricus rubellus, fairly common in the UK. And the question one would pose is, are these earthworms healthy? And generally the consensus is perhaps the earthworm on the left-hand side, which has got a rather distinct long yellow tail, may not be looking entirely normal in terms of earthworms. And my other sort of picture of Rogue's gallery of earthworms is this one. This is one of my favorites. So down here again, these are Lumbricus rubellus earthworms. We've got sort of regular looking earthworms at the top of the picture, labeled reference and stream. Down here, just above cottage, we've got a see-through earthworm. And you can see its intestines wiggling all the way down to its rear end. And again, if you saw this earthworm, you'd probably think that was slightly peculiar, perhaps. And these earthworms are excellent examples of just how adaptive earthworms are and how they can survive in different soils. Because I would argue that the soils you find these odd-looking earthworms in are probably not what you would call healthy soils. But despite that, they have a thriving earthworm population. So if we go back to our yellow-tailed earthworm, so this work was started by a guy called Trevor Pierce and his PhD student Caroline Langdon in Lancaster. Then I did some work on these sites with Pete Kill from Cardiff and Dave Spurgeon from Wallingford Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And these earthworms have been sampled from a site called Devon Great Consols, which is a former arsenic mine in the southwest of England. It used to be said that there was sufficient arsenic on the quays of the ports which exported from this mine to poison the entire world. It's been closed now. We generally don't use arsenic. There used to be a big market for green wallpaper, and the wallpaper dye was an arsenic compound. But they had to stop making that because they discovered the bacteria living in the wallpaper paste reacted with the arsenic to turn the arsenic into a gaseous form, which people inhaled, and it killed them. So we've tended to stop using that as wallpaper dye. But what appears to be happening with this earthworm, this yellow-tailed earthworm, is that the earthworm has an organ called a chloragog. It's analogous to our livers. So it's involved in processing material and detoxifying it. And without going into the details, it's thought that this earthworm's chloragog is so large, it's a yellow-coloured tissue that you can see it through the earthworm's skin. And the other interesting thing is that genetically, this earthworm actually has all the same genes as its colleague over here, which is looking like a normal earthworm. It just is able to turn certain genes on by a process called methylation, which allows it then to enlarge its chloragog. So there's an example of an earthworm living in a soil which is probably not described as healthy. You can see there's still large areas of unvegetated material at this abandoned mine, and the arsenic levels are really high. Our second example is from a Welsh site called Cymystwyth, which is the head of the river which feeds into Aberystwyth, if you know Wales. And so we studied these earthworms as part of Jane Andre's PhD, again with Pete Kill, my colleague in Cardiff, and John Morgan, one of his colleagues, and Stephen Sturzenbaum, who's now at King's College in London. So unlike the arsenic surviving earthworms, these earthworms are slightly different. The story is slightly different here. Again, the species is the same. If you got a earthworm identification key and sort of looked at the saddle, this sort of lumpy area on the earthworms here, and looked at the reproductive organs of the earthworm and its mouth parts, you'd reach the conclusion that all of these earthworms are Lumbricus rubellus. But actually, if you look at these things in terms of genetics, you would find that this cottage earthworm is sufficiently different genetically that some geneticists would say this is a different species of earthworm from the earthworms above it. And so it does look in this case as if we've had some sort of environmental pressure driving a change in the genetic makeup of these earthworms. So this is evolution really in practice. So how does that work? Well, as I said, I'm not a very good artist. This is my drawing of an earthworm. You can see this is its body. We come up to its head. This is its mouth, and then we go back into its body. And if an earthworm encounters metals in the soil and ingests those metals, for example, lead and zinc, like at this former lead and zinc mine in Wales, what happens is some of those metals will become soluble, so they'll dissolve in the sort of tissue fluids of the earthworm and have a toxic effect. But others will be converted into insoluble forms. They'll essentially be precipitated, so they just sit as insoluble solids in the earthworm, not causing any harm, usually as metal phosphates. And it looks like the genes in the earthworms from the metal contaminated sites are better at dealing with metals. So here we've got a naive earthworm. So a naive organism in the world of toxicology is one which hasn't been exposed to contaminants. So a naive earthworm exposed to metals, which are these red stars, will ingest the metals. Some will have a toxic effect, they'll remain soluble, and others will become insoluble, and the earthworm will detoxify them. Our Cummersmith earthworm is exposed to far more metals, and it is far more efficient at taking those metals and making them non-toxic by precipitating them. So the ratio of soluble to insoluble, or toxic to non-toxic metals, is far higher in the naive earthworms. So that's how the earthworms are able to survive in that metal contamination site. They've got genes which allow them to better detoxify the metals. And we go one stage further than that. We can look at the types of genes. This is something called an express sequence tag library. I'm not, again, going to go into the details of here, but what this analysis tells us is that the earthworms at the contaminated sites have far more genes involved in moving calcium around their bodies. And that's important because one of the reasons that lead and zinc is toxic is that the enzymes in an earthworm's body mistake the lead and zinc for calcium. So they grab some lead or zinc and move it around the body. They should be moving calcium. They've made a mistake and that has a toxic effect. But by having more of these genes, those earthworms can actually afford to make the mistakes. And actually, some of the genes are mutated and it looks like they're maybe modified. So they deliberately target lead and zinc and remove that from sites where they might be having a toxic effect. So there's this enzyme called sarcoplasmic endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase, bit of a mouthful. And there are important differences we've been able to find in this molecule between our our evolved earthworms and our regular standard earthworms. So that's another example of a soil which you might say is not healthy but has a thriving earthworm population. And so perhaps they're unfair examples, sort of earthworms as invasive species and earthworms which have adapted or evolved to cope in contaminated soils are perhaps not the usual context that people talk about earthworms indicating healthy soils, but they nonetheless indicate that earthworms can be present in soils which you wouldn't necessarily would say were healthy. But we'll come back to Darwin's quote about earthworms within a field sometimes being present and sometimes being absent and not knowing why that is. And so recently we decided to look into that a bit more. So we got some money from one of the UK's research councils and we did some work on this. So this cast of thousands, this is Ron Corstangi. He's a statistician from the Cranfield University. We've got David Jones, who works at the Natural History Museums, an earthworm ecologist. Joe Witten, who now actually works for the Health and Safety Executive. Victoria Burton, she works on earthworm ecology. Tom Sloan, who now works in climate science at the University of Leeds, and Paul Eggleton from the Natural History Museum, who's an earthworm specialist as well. And what we did in our experiment, we travelled around the UK sampling earthworms, and we sampled earthworms from 7 different farms. So we moved from the north, Crabston in Aberdeen, down to Swanage in the south. So we had a sort of north to south temperature gradient, and we worked from the west, Torness, down to Skeffling Farm in the east. So we had a sort of rainfall gradient as well. And at each of these farms, we went to 4 different fields, and we attempted to sample earthworms at 20 different sites in each field. So that's 80 sampling points per farm. We ended up digging about 530 soil pits. So we didn't quite make 20 in each field because sometimes it got too dark to dig. And we collected over 13,000 earthworms, which David Jones and Victoria Burton then identified to species level. And as well as looking at the earthworms, we measured a whole host of other stuff. Anything we could think of which might help explain why in one hole there was a large number of earthworms and in another hole there were very few earthworms. So things like microbial activity, how compacted the soil was, so the soil density, how wet the soil was, its temperature, the nutrient status of the soil, the type of rocks the soil was developed on, sort of vegetation cover, that sort of thing. And we've got a whole host of data, and I'm just going to tell you about how we analysed that data and what conclusions we reached. So the first thing we did was just a simple count of the earthworms. So earthworms occur in 3 different ecotypes, we call them. They occur in 3 different parts of the soil. There are endogeic earthworms, which actually live within the soil, about sort of 10 to 30 centimetres depth, and they ingest the soil as they move through it. We have epigeic earthworms, which live on the surface of the soil, and anesic earthworms, which live in fairly permanent vertical burrows. And so what we find when we looked at all these earthworms, the majority of the earthworms we found were juveniles, they weren't adult. And it's very difficult to identify earthworms if they're just juveniles. You can work out their sort of ecotype. Are they the endogeics, the soil dwellers, the epigeics, the surface dwellers, or the anesics? But that's about it. In terms of the earthworms we could identify at a species level, the most common ones were the ones which lived in the soil, and particularly something called Caliginosa and another one called Chlorotica, which is a nice green earthworm. And then less common were the epigeics, the surface dwellers, and the vertical burrow dwellers as well, the anesics. So this gave us some interesting information about the relative abundances of different earthworms. And actually, there's not that much information about the relative abundance of earthworms dotted around the country. This applies to Ireland as well. And if you're interested in helping boost records of earthworms, there's an Earthworm Society which would be happy to talk to you about collecting earthworms as part of the citizen science program. There's all sorts of other organisms like woodlice in particular, woodlice and butterflies and moths. Lots of people sort of monitor these and provide data for monitoring schemes. Earthworms are sadly neglected on this sort of scheme. So another thing we did was to look at the relative abundance in each of our different fields. So as I said, for each field, we looked at 4 fields for each farm. So they're labelled here, for field 1 down to field 4 for each of our 7 farms. And when we sampled in these fields, we asked the farmers to tell us how intensively they managed those fields, each one individually. And so we didn't tell the farmers what we meant by intensely managed. We left that up to the farmers to decide, but really we wanted to know which of these fields is the one you do least to, and which is the one which has the most intense management to it. And what we've done here is these fields are arranged in order of increasing intensity of management. So for Crabston, it happened that fields 1 to 4 were in the order of increased intensity of management. But you can see for Tor Organic Farm in Dumfries, actually field 2 was the least intensively managed and field 3 was the most intensively managed. But what we see in this data, and this, I think this did surprise us, was that it wasn't always the least intensely managed field which had the most earthworms in it. So it's not that if you just leave the fields alone, these are pasture fields, if you leave them alone, you get a thriving population of earthworms. And if you interfere with the field and manage it, you'll reduce the earthworm numbers. That certainly wasn't the case. What we then did, and I say we, this was Ron Corstange, he did some statistical magic called Bayesian belief networks. And we don't really need to understand, or I certainly don't understand what a Bayesian belief network is, but they essentially look at the likelihood of a particular variable, something you've measured, being responsible for another variable, in our case, earthworm abundance. So this analysis told us what of the stuff we measured in our fields, what is most likely controlling the abundance of the earthworms. And on a national and a farm level, we found things like the temperature and the moisture content. So physical parameters were important, as was the nitrate content in the soil and the soil density, so how compact it was. And then at the farm level, so we couldn't do this at the national level because we allowed farmers to independently define what they meant by management intensity. But at the farm level, management intensity was also having an important role in governing earthworm abundance. And that was the same regardless of whether we looked at the surface dwellers, the epigeics, the endogeics, the ones that lived in the soil, or the vertical burrowers, the anesics. And then for each species, we plotted the abundance of species against some of these parameters. So here, for example, you can see for soil bulk density, we've got a blue curve here. This was for, I'm squinting now, this was for chlorotica. Abundances at low soil densities were quite low. Abundance increased with density, and then as density kept on increasing, abundance decreased again. And so what we saw for different species were distinct preferences for nitrate and soil density. Perhaps for pH and soil moisture content, but not so much, and no other real relationships. And the final thing that we did was to actually make use of the spatial distribution of our sampling. So we did some spatial analysis. So what you can see here is an example from Tor Farm, and you can see our 4 fields, 1, 2, 3, 4. These individual dots are our sampling sites, and some of these sampling sites had no earthworms in. The red ones had really high numbers. You can take this data and do some fancy statistics to produce something called a variogram. And these statistics were actually designed for mineral prospectors searching for ore fields. And so you take a series of spatially distinct sampling points and run some statistics to see whether those sampling points have any structure to them, which essentially is saying, are the numbers of earthworms you're digging up from these different pits randomly distributed, or is there some pattern to your data? And what you can in turn do is use that to construct contour maps. And so that's what these contour maps are on the original pictures. These are contours, just like height contours, which tell you how many earthworms you'd like to find in this particular area. And what we found with that analysis was that in 2 farms, the distribution of earthworms in each field appeared to be completely random, no pattern whatsoever. And then in the other 5 farms, the earthworms seemed to be clumped in patches of about 30 to 100 meters. So you get a patch of high numbers of earthworms. You moved 30 to 100 meters in any direction, very few earthworms. And what's more, that random pattern of patches of earthworms showed absolutely no relationship to anything else we'd measured in the fields. No relationship to moisture content or organic matter content or nutrients or vegetation or anything. And again, I think we were probably slightly disappointed by that. And the other thing you can do with our data is, given that the amount of earthworms you dig up in a sample site in a field is so variable, there's a question of how many holes or how many pits do you have to dig to sample your earthworms to know with good approximation what the earthworm abundance is like in your field. And our calculations suggest you need to take about 8 to 10 samples. These fields, I think they're up to about 3 hectares in size, but we needed 8 to 10 samples per field to get a good idea of how many earthworms we've got in that field. And that's important if you're talking about monitoring earthworm populations for assessing soil health. And it matches quite well with some of the other popular schemes like Jackie Stroud's 30 to 60 minute earthworm survey. So what did that work on looking at earthworm distributions tell us? Well, it told us, and I think we were disappointed by this, that there didn't seem to be any simple relationship between earthworm abundance and any one particular chemical or physical parameter. So this really ties back into what Darwin said all those years ago. You go to different parts in the field which look identical, and sometimes you get lots of earthworms and sometimes you don't get many. So we found the distribution of earthworms very patchy. There were climate-related factors which were important, things like temperature and moisture, and certainly things like soil density and nitrate are important as well, and locally, management intensity. But we were unable really to predict with any degree of accuracy how many earthworms we might find at any particular point in the field on the basis of that field's properties. So, do earthworms indicate healthy soils? Well, in part, I think it depends on your definition of soil health. You know, if a healthy soil is one which contains earthworms, it's a circular argument. Lots of earthworms indicate a healthy soil. But under normal circumstances, certainly earthworms do lots of good stuff. You know, they help plants grow, they help aerate soil, they reduce soil erosion, they help with chemical cycling of nutrients. If you want to know how many earthworms you've got in a field, I think you need to dig at least 8 to 10 randomly distributed holes to have a look at that. And although I do think earthworms are good for your soil, and we should certainly encourage earthworms in soils, and there are ways of doing that, for example, adding organic matter to soils. I'm just slightly nervous still about some of the plans to use earthworm monitoring as a funding scheme or as a component of the funding scheme for UK farmers, because at the moment we actually don't understand what controls earthworm distributions. We've made lots of measurements, we've done lots of research, and we can't predict whether a field will have lots of earthworms or fewer earthworms. And I think we should be able to do that before we start using changes in earthworm numbers from one year to another as a way of helping determine payments to farmers. So I'm going to leave it there. I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much for your attention. Hope you found some of that interesting, and I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions people may have. So thank you very much.
Thank you so